The morning mist hung low over London's ancient cobblestones as thousands of tourists began their daily pilgrimage to witness one of Britain's most cherished traditions. Among the crowd gathering outside Buckingham Palace, a small group of Japanese visitors stood quietly, their demeanor markedly different from the excited chatter and camera flashes surrounding them. Led by an elderly gentleman named Hiroshi Tanaka, this group of 12 had traveled over 6,000 miles not just as tourists, but as bearers of a profound cultural mission that would soon transform an ordinary day into something extraordinary. Hiroshi adjusted his perfectly pressed black suit and checked his pocket watch, a family heirloom passed down through 3 generations. At 72, he moved with the measured grace of someone who had spent decades perfecting the art of respectful presence. His weathered hands, marked by years of dedicated craftsmanship as a master woodworker in Kyoto, held a significance that extended far beyond his profession. These hands had built temples, crafted instruments for traditional ceremonies, and, more importantly, had been taught by his grandfather the sacred rituals of showing respect to those who serve their nation with honor. The group accompanying Hiroshi was carefully chosen, each member representing different aspects of Japanese society yet united by a common understanding of duty and respect. There was Kenji Sato, a former officer in Japan's self-defense forces who understood military protocol better than most civilians. His military bearing was evident even in civilian clothes, standing with shoulders square and eyes alert, constantly observing the British guards with professional appreciation. Beside him stood Yuki Nakamura, a tea ceremony master whose entire life revolved around the principles of harmony, respect, purity, and tranquility. Her presence added a spiritual dimension to their mission, representing the deeper philosophical aspects of what they were about to undertake. Dr. Akira Yamamoto, a history professor specializing in international relations between Japan and Britain, had spent months researching the protocols and traditions surrounding the Royal Guard. His briefcase contained carefully prepared documents detailing the historical connections between the two nations, including the mutual respect that had developed between Japanese and British military traditions over the past century. The youngest member of the group was Sakura Ito, a cultural exchange student who had been living in London for 6 months. Her fluency in English would prove invaluable, but, more importantly, her genuine enthusiasm for bridging cultural gaps brought an energy that balanced the solemnity of their older companions. The remaining members included a Buddhist monk named Jishin who specialized in interfaith dialogue, a former diplomat's wife who understood international etiquette, 2 business executives who had worked extensively with British companies, a traditional artist who painted portraits of military figures, and, finally, a young photographer whose grandfather had served alongside British forces during peacekeeping missions in the 1970s. Each person carried not just their individual expertise, but also personal stories that connected them to the broader narrative of respect and honor they were about to demonstrate. As the morning progressed, the crowd around Buckingham Palace grew thicker. Tour guides shouted explanations in various languages, children pressed against the barriers hoping for a better view, and the familiar sounds of London traffic created a backdrop of urban energy. The Japanese group remained notably still amid this chaos, their quiet observation drawing curious glances from nearby tourists. They had positioned themselves strategically, not at the front of the crowd where the most eager sightseers gathered, but at a spot where they would have clear sightlines while maintaining respectful distance from the ceremonial proceedings. Hiroshi had been planning this moment for over 2 years. It began as a simple idea during a conversation with his grandson, who was studying international relations at Tokyo University. The young man had mentioned learning about various military traditions around the world, including the legendary discipline and dedication of the British Royal Guard. This sparked something in Hiroshi's mind, connecting to memories of his own grandfather's stories about honor, duty, and the universal language of respect that transcended national boundaries. The planning process had been meticulous, reflecting the Japanese cultural value of thorough preparation. Hiroshi had contacted cultural associations, reached out to former diplomats, and even corresponded with British cultural institutions to ensure that their planned gesture would be appropriate and meaningful rather than presumptuous or disruptive. Every detail had been considered, from the timing of their arrival to the specific location where they would position themselves, from the coordination of their movements to the significance of each element they would present. The British Royal Guard, meanwhile, continued their duties with the same unwavering professionalism they had maintained for centuries. These men, selected through rigorous testing and training, represented more than just military precision. They embodied a living connection to British history, standing as symbols of stability and continuity in an ever-changing world. Their red tunics and towering bearskin hats were not mere costumes but uniforms steeped in tradition, each element carrying historical significance earned through centuries of service. Staff Sergeant William Matthews, standing at his post near the palace gates, had noticed the Japanese group earlier in the morning. His trained eye, developed through 15 years of service, was always alert to unusual patterns in crowd behavior. The group's respectful distance, their patient waiting, and their obvious preparation struck him as different from typical tourist behavior. Something about their demeanor reminded him of military visitors he had encountered during ceremonial exchanges with foreign delegations. There was a formality to their presence that spoke of purpose beyond mere sightseeing. The other guards had noticed too. Corporal James Henderson, a veteran of 2 overseas deployments, found himself occasionally glancing toward the Japanese visitors during the brief moments when protocol allowed. Their stillness was remarkable in contrast to the constant movement and chatter of other tourists. It reminded him of the disciplined patience he had observed in Japanese peacekeeping forces during a joint training exercise several years earlier. The memory brought a slight smile to his otherwise stoic expression. As the morning ceremony commenced, the familiar routine of the changing of the guard began to unfold. The precision of the movements, the synchronization of the steps, and the musical accompaniment created a spectacle that had captivated visitors for generations. The Japanese group watched with an intensity that went beyond casual observation. They were studying every detail, not with the detached curiosity of tourists, but with the focused attention of people who understood the deeper significance of military ceremony and tradition. Yuki Nakamura found herself deeply moved by the parallels she observed between this British ceremony and traditional Japanese rituals. The emphasis on perfect execution, the respect for established forms, and the way individual identity dissolved into collective purpose reminded her of the tea ceremony's fundamental principles. She began to see the guards not as foreign soldiers but as practitioners of their own form of disciplined art, masters of a tradition that demanded the same level of dedication and precision that defined her own cultural practices. Dr. Yamamoto was mentally cataloging the historical elements he witnessed, connecting them to his research on ceremonial traditions across cultures. The British pageantry before him represented centuries of refined protocol, much like the formal ceremonies that had developed in Japanese imperial courts. He recognized that what they were witnessing was not simply a tourist attraction but a living manifestation of cultural values that prized duty, honor, and collective identity over individual expression. The crowd's energy shifted as the ceremony reached its climax. Camera flashes increased, voices rose in excitement, and the general atmosphere became more charged with anticipation. Yet the Japanese group maintained their composed observation, creating an island of calm dignity amid the surrounding enthusiasm. This contrast became more pronounced as other tourists pushed forward for better views or called out questions to the guards, while the Japanese visitors remained in their chosen positions, watching with respectful attention. Hiroshi felt the weight of the moment building. Everything they had planned, every careful preparation, was leading to this point. He looked at each member of his group, receiving subtle nods of acknowledgement. The time was approaching when they would transform from observers to participants, when their carefully planned gesture would either succeed in creating a bridge of understanding or risk being misunderstood as presumption. The responsibility he felt was enormous, representing not just his own intentions but the cultural values of his entire nation. As the official ceremony concluded and the crowds began to disperse, the Japanese group remained in position. This was when their real purpose would be revealed, when months of planning would culminate in a demonstration of respect that would challenge assumptions about cultural boundaries and reveal the universal language of honor that connects military traditions across the world. The guards, still maintaining their posts, were about to encounter something unprecedented in their years of service, something that would remind them why their duties carried meaning far beyond the borders of their own country. The stage was set for an interaction that would transcend the typical tourist experience, creating a moment of genuine cultural exchange that honored both British military tradition and Japanese values of respect and ceremony. What began as a simple idea in an elderly craftsman's mind was about to become a powerful demonstration of how understanding and respect can bridge any cultural divide, creating connections that speak to the universal human appreciation for duty, honor, and service to something greater than oneself. The dispersing crowd created the perfect moment for what Hiroshi had been planning. As tourists began walking away, chattering about their photographs and experiences, the Japanese group moved with quiet purpose toward a position directly facing the royal guards. Their movement was so coordinated and deliberate that it immediately caught the attention of the remaining guards, who had been expecting the usual post-ceremony routine of tourists gradually departing and the return to normal security protocols. Staff Sergeant Matthews watched as the 12 Japanese visitors formed a precise line, maintaining perfect spacing between each person. Their positioning was clearly intentional, creating a formation that spoke of military understanding and respect for protocol. The elderly man at the center, whom Matthews had been observing throughout the morning, stepped slightly forward and reached into his jacket. For a brief moment, security instincts kicked in, but the man's movements were slow, deliberate, and obviously ceremonial rather than threatening. What Hiroshi withdrew from his jacket was a carefully folded document, prepared on traditional Japanese paper and written in both Japanese calligraphy and English. The document represented weeks of collaboration between himself, Dr. Yamamoto, and several cultural experts in both Japan and Britain. It was not simply a letter but a formal expression of respect that followed traditional Japanese diplomatic protocols while acknowledging British military customs. The paper itself had been specially selected, made using traditional methods that dated back centuries, representing the depth of consideration that had gone into this moment. Sakura Ito stepped forward as the designated translator, though her role went far beyond simple language conversion. She had spent considerable time working with Hiroshi to understand not just the words but the cultural significance behind every phrase in the document. Her voice, when she began to speak, carried the weight of genuine emotion and cultural pride. The surrounding area had grown quieter as nearby tourists, sensing something significant was happening, stopped to observe rather than continuing on their way. The formal reading began with traditional acknowledgments that established the context and purpose of their visit. Sakura's clear voice carried across the courtyard as she explained that they had traveled from Japan specifically to honor the British Royal Guard, recognizing their dedication, professionalism, and the values they represented. The words were carefully chosen to demonstrate understanding of British military tradition while expressing the deep respect that Japanese culture holds for those who dedicate their lives to service and duty. Dr. Yamamoto had insisted that the document include specific references to historical connections between Japanese and British military forces, acknowledging moments of cooperation and mutual respect that had developed over decades of diplomatic and military interaction. These references were not mere academic citations but genuine expressions of gratitude for the professional relationships that had developed between the two nations' service members during various international peacekeeping and humanitarian missions. As Sakura continued reading, the guards maintained their professional stance while clearly listening intently to every word. Staff Sergeant Matthews found himself genuinely moved by the unexpected formality and thoughtfulness of the presentation. In his 15 years of service, he had encountered numerous dignitaries, participated in various ceremonial exchanges, and witnessed countless tourist interactions, but nothing had prepared him for this spontaneous yet obviously carefully planned demonstration of international respect. Corporal Henderson, standing at attention nearby, felt a swelling of professional pride as he listened to the Japanese visitors acknowledge the discipline, dedication, and sacrifice that defined military service. The words resonated deeply because they came not from political officials or ceremonial obligations but from private citizens who had chosen to travel thousands of miles simply to express their appreciation for values they recognized and honored in their own culture. The document continued with specific acknowledgments of the Guards' daily commitment to their duties, recognizing that their service extended far beyond the ceremonial aspects that tourists typically observed. The Japanese visitors had clearly researched and understood that these men were active military personnel whose responsibilities included real security duties, emergency response capabilities, and the maintenance of traditions that connected present-day Britain to its historical foundations. Kenji Sato, the former Self-Defense Forces officer, stepped forward when Sakura reached the section of the document that addressed military brotherhood. His own military bearing was evident as he spoke briefly about the universal bonds that connect service members across national boundaries, acknowledging that military personnel worldwide share common experiences of training, discipline, and dedication that create understanding even when language and culture might otherwise create barriers. The crowd of remaining tourists had grown larger rather than smaller, as word spread that something unusual and significant was taking place. People who had been walking away returned to witness what was clearly a meaningful cultural exchange. The atmosphere had transformed from the typical post-ceremony dispersal to something resembling a formal diplomatic event, with the Japanese group's dignified presentation creating a sense of occasion that commanded respect and attention. Yuki Nakamura's contribution came when the ceremony reached its spiritual dimensions. She spoke about the Japanese concept of duty that extends beyond personal interest, connecting individual service to larger purposes that benefit entire communities and nations. Her words, translated carefully by Sakura, drew parallels between the guards' commitment to their posts and the dedication required in traditional Japanese arts and spiritual practices, where mastery comes through years of disciplined repetition and selfless devotion to perfectionism. The guards were visibly affected by this unexpected recognition of the deeper significance of their service. Many had joined the military for practical reasons, career opportunities, family traditions, or personal challenges, but few had expected their daily duties to be recognized as part of a global tradition of honorable service that transcended national boundaries. The Japanese visitors were offering them a perspective on their own work that elevated it from routine duty to cultural significance. When the formal reading concluded, Hiroshi stepped forward again, this time carrying a beautifully crafted wooden box. The box itself was a work of art, created by his own hands using traditional Japanese joinery techniques that required no nails or screws, representing the precision and patience that defined his approach to craftsmanship. Inside the box were 12 small items, each carefully selected to represent different aspects of Japanese culture and respect. The first item was a small piece of wood from a cherry tree that grew near a shrine dedicated to fallen soldiers in Hiroshi's hometown. The wood had been shaped and polished into a smooth stone-like form, representing the enduring nature of honor and the way sacrifice becomes part of the foundation for future generations. Each guard would receive one of these pieces, creating a physical connection between their service and the gratitude of people they had never met but who recognized their dedication. The second item was a traditional Japanese good luck charm, specifically chosen for protection and strength. These charms, blessed by Buddhist monks at temples throughout Japan, represented the spiritual support and positive wishes of an entire community extending across the ocean to recognize and support the guards' continued service. The charms were small enough to be carried discreetly but significant enough to serve as ongoing reminders of international friendship and respect. The presentation of these gifts created another layer of ceremonial significance to the encounter. The guards, still maintaining their professional positions, were clearly moved by the thoughtfulness and cultural weight of what they were receiving. These were not tourist souvenirs or casual tokens but carefully considered gifts that carried genuine meaning and represented hours of preparation and consideration. Staff Sergeant Matthews stepped forward to accept the gifts on behalf of his unit, his military training providing the protocol for responding to this unprecedented situation. His words of thanks, spoken with genuine emotion, acknowledged not just the gifts themselves but the spirit of international friendship and respect that had motivated the Japanese group's journey. He spoke of the honor the guards felt in having their service recognized by visitors who had traveled so far specifically to express their appreciation. The exchange was being observed by a growing crowd that included not just tourists but also local Londoners who had stopped to witness what was clearly an extraordinary moment of cultural bridge building. Many were taking photographs and videos, but the atmosphere was respectful rather than intrusive, as if everyone present recognized they were witnessing something genuinely significant rather than merely unusual. As the formal presentation concluded, the Japanese visitors prepared for the final element of their carefully planned demonstration. This would be the most dramatic and potentially risky aspect of their cultural exchange, requiring not just coordination among themselves but also the cooperation and understanding of the guards who had already shown such gracious professionalism in accepting their unexpected tribute. The success of what came next would determine whether their gesture would be remembered as a beautiful moment of international understanding or as a well-intentioned but ultimately awkward misunderstanding of British military protocol. The moment that would define the entire encounter was approaching. Hiroshi looked toward his companions and gave an almost imperceptible nod, a signal they had practiced numerous times in their hotel room the previous evening. What happened next would either create a powerful bridge between cultures or risk being seen as an inappropriate breach of military protocol. The Japanese group's months of research and cultural consultation had led them to this decisive moment. Moving with the synchronized precision that characterizes traditional Japanese group activities, all 12 visitors began to bow simultaneously. This was not the casual bow that tourists might offer or the quick acknowledgement that business people exchange, but a formal, deep bow known as saikiri, the most respectful form of bowing in Japanese culture, typically reserved for the most solemn and significant occasions. The bow required them to bend from the waist at a 90-degree angle and hold the position for an extended period, demonstrating complete vulnerability and absolute respect. The impact on the watching guards was immediate and profound. Staff Sergeant Matthews felt something shift in his chest as he watched 12 people who had traveled thousands of miles perform this ancient gesture of respect specifically for him and his fellow guards. The formality and obvious significance of the bow transcended any language barriers or cultural unfamiliarity. Even without understanding the specific protocols of Japanese culture, it was impossible to mistake the depth of respect being demonstrated. For the guards, who were trained to remain motionless and expressionless regardless of what happened around them, this presented an unprecedented challenge. Their military discipline required them to maintain their posts and their professional demeanor, but the emotional impact of witnessing such a profound gesture of respect was testing their ability to remain unmoved. Several of the younger guards felt their eyes beginning to water, touched by the realization that their daily service was being honored in such an extraordinary way. The crowd of observers fell completely silent. The usual sounds of London traffic seemed to fade into the background as everyone present recognized they were witnessing something remarkable. Tourist cameras continued recording, but the clicking and flashing had stopped, replaced by a respectful quiet that allowed the moment to unfold without distraction. Even children in the crowd seemed to sense the significance of what was happening and watched in amazed silence. Corporal Henderson, who had been serving for 8 years and considered himself experienced in handling unusual situations, found himself struggling to process the emotional weight of the moment. The Japanese visitors were maintaining their bow far longer than he had expected, demonstrating a level of commitment to the gesture that spoke to its genuine significance. This was not a quick acknowledgement or a tourist photo opportunity but a serious ceremonial act that demanded recognition and response. The monk, Jishin, had insisted during their planning that the bow should be held for a full minute, explaining that this duration would demonstrate the sincerity of their respect and allow the significance of the moment to be fully appreciated by everyone present. 60 seconds might seem brief in normal circumstances, but when 12 people are holding a formal 90-degree bow in front of an audience, it becomes a powerfully extended statement that cannot be ignored or misunderstood. As the seconds passed, the guards began to realize that some kind of response was appropriate, even if it meant departing slightly from their normal protocols. The situation was clearly unprecedented, and the respect being shown to them deserved acknowledgement. Staff Sergeant Matthews made a command decision that would be discussed and remembered for years afterward. Moving slowly and deliberately, maintaining his professional bearing while adapting to the extraordinary circumstances, he began to return the bow. The sight of a British Royal Guard, in full ceremonial uniform, bowing in response to the Japanese visitors created a moment of cultural fusion that transcended normal diplomatic protocols. Matthew's bow was not as deep as the traditional Japanese form, reflecting his military bearing and uniform constraints, but it was unmistakably genuine and respectful. His action was immediately followed by the other guards present, who recognized their sergeant's lead and responded accordingly. What followed was an extraordinary tableau: 12 Japanese civilians and 6 British guards, representing two nations with vastly different histories and traditions, acknowledging each other with mutual respect in one of London's most famous public spaces. The cultural significance of the moment was not lost on anyone present, as two distinct forms of respectful acknowledgement, British military courtesy and Japanese ceremonial bowing, merged into a single expression of international understanding. Dr. Yamamoto, still maintaining his bow, felt tears running down his cheeks as he realized their carefully planned gesture had succeeded beyond their wildest hopes. The guards' willingness to respond with their own gesture of respect demonstrated that the universal language of honor and recognition could indeed transcend cultural boundaries. This was precisely what he had hoped might happen, but experiencing it in reality was far more moving than he had anticipated. Yuki Nakamura, whose life was dedicated to the principles of harmony and mutual respect, found herself experiencing what she would later describe as a perfect moment of wa, the Japanese concept of peaceful unity that emerges when different elements come together in harmony. The sight of British guards responding to Japanese bowing created exactly the kind of cultural bridge she had spent her life promoting through her tea ceremony teachings. When the formal bowing concluded, both groups straightened with obvious emotion. The guards returned to their positions but, with expressions that had subtly changed from their previous professional neutrality to something warmer and more personally engaged. The Japanese visitors remained in their formation, but the tension of anticipation had been replaced by the satisfaction of successful cultural exchange. Sakura Ito stepped forward once more, but this time her role was less formal. Speaking directly to Staff Sergeant Matthews, she expressed the group's gratitude for the guards' gracious response and explained that they would treasure the memory of this moment for the rest of their lives. Her words carried genuine emotion, reflecting not just her own feelings but those of her entire group, who had invested so much hope and preparation in creating this cross-cultural encounter. The crowd began to applaud, but it was not the casual clapping that might follow a tourist spectacle. The applause was sustained and respectful, acknowledging that everyone present had witnessed something genuinely significant. Many in the crowd were visibly moved, with several people wiping away tears as they recognized the beauty of what had just occurred between the Japanese visitors and British guards. Local news reporters, who had been attracted by the unusual crowd gathering, began interviewing witnesses and trying to understand the background of what they had observed. The story would soon spread beyond the immediate vicinity, reaching international media and social networks, carrying the message of cultural respect and understanding to audiences around the world. The Japanese group's private gesture of respect was becoming a public symbol of international friendship. Staff Sergeant Matthews approached Hiroshi directly, speaking personally rather than in his official capacity. He expressed his genuine gratitude for the respect shown to him and his fellow guards, acknowledging that in all his years of service, he had never experienced anything comparable to what the Japanese group had offered. His words were simple but heartfelt, creating a moment of direct human connection that transcended the formal aspects of what had preceded it. The guard shift change was approaching, but the normal routine felt different now. The incoming guards were quickly briefed about what had occurred, and the story began spreading through the ranks of the Royal Guard Regiment. What had started as a routine day of ceremonial duties had transformed into an experience that would be remembered and discussed throughout the military community, serving as a reminder of the international respect and recognition that their service commanded. As the Japanese group prepared to conclude their visit, they understood that they had accomplished far more than their original goal of expressing respect. They had created a moment of genuine cultural exchange that demonstrated how understanding and appreciation could bridge even the widest gaps between different traditions and ways of life. The success of their gesture would inspire similar expressions of international friendship and serve as a model for meaningful cross-cultural interaction. The ripple effects of that extraordinary moment began immediately and would continue spreading for months afterward. As the Japanese group prepared to leave Buckingham Palace, they were approached by numerous onlookers who wanted to understand what they had witnessed and express their own appreciation for the cultural bridge that had been built before their eyes. The spontaneous conversations that emerged created an extended celebration of international understanding that lasted well into the afternoon. Among those most deeply affected was Margaret Thompson, a retired teacher who had been visiting London with her grandchildren. She approached Hiroshi with tears in her eyes, explaining that her late husband had served in the Royal Navy and would have been profoundly moved by the respect shown to military service. Her grandchildren, initially puzzled by the formal ceremony they had witnessed, found themselves asking thoughtful questions about different cultures and the importance of showing respect to people who serve others. The photographer from the group, whose grandfather had served alongside British forces, found himself surrounded by people wanting copies of the images he had captured. These were not typical tourist photos but carefully composed shots that documented each phase of the cultural exchange. His background in traditional Japanese photography, with its emphasis on capturing emotional truth rather than mere visual spectacle, had resulted in images that conveyed the spiritual significance of what had occurred. Dr. Yamamoto was approached by a BBC journalist who had been alerted to the story by social media posts from witnesses. The interview that followed would become part of a longer feature about grassroots cultural diplomacy and the power of individual citizens to create positive international relationships. The professor's ability to articulate the historical and cultural significance of what had occurred helped audiences understand that this was far more than a heartwarming tourist story. The guards themselves were experiencing the aftermath of their emotional response to the Japanese gesture. During their brief break, several shared their feelings about the unexpected recognition they had received. Corporal Henderson mentioned that his family had always supported his military service, but seeing complete strangers travel so far specifically to honor that service gave him a new perspective on the broader significance of his daily duties. Staff Sergeant Matthews took the unusual step of requesting permission to write a formal report about the encounter, wanting to ensure that the event was properly documented in the regiment's records. His superiors, initially puzzled by the request, became deeply interested as he described what had occurred. The story quickly moved up the chain of command, eventually reaching officers who recognized its potential significance for British-Japanese relations. The wooden gifts from the cherry tree near the Japanese War Memorial were distributed among the guards with careful attention to their significance. Each guard was provided with a written explanation of the gift's meaning, translated into English by Sakura Ito. The small pieces of wood, polished smooth by Hiroshi's expert hands, became treasured mementos that several guards later said they carried with them during subsequent tours of duty. Meanwhile, the Japanese group proceeded to the next phase of their London visit, but the emotional high from their successful cultural exchange colored everything they experienced. Their planned tour of other historical sites became more meaningful as they found themselves welcomed with unusual warmth by tour guides and fellow visitors who had heard about their gesture at Buckingham Palace. Word of their respectful tribute had spread through London's tourist community, creating a positive reputation that opened doors and hearts wherever they went. Yuki Nakamura found herself invited to demonstrate tea ceremony principles at a cultural center in Kensington, where the manager had heard about the morning's events and wanted to provide a platform for further cultural sharing. Her impromptu presentation to a mixed audience of British and international visitors became another opportunity to explain the Japanese values of respect, harmony, and careful attention to meaningful gesture that had motivated their tribute to the Royal Guard. The former diplomat's wife in their group, Mrs. Imiko Suzuki, received a phone call from the Japanese embassy in London. Embassy staff had been monitoring British media coverage of the incident and wanted to understand more about this unofficial diplomatic gesture. Rather than being concerned about unauthorized cultural representation, embassy officials were impressed by the positive response and began discussing ways to incorporate similar grassroots cultural exchanges into official diplomatic programming. Back at Buckingham Palace, the story of the Japanese visitors was being shared among the various guard units and support staff. The palace's social media team, always alert for positive stories that showcased the institution's international appeal, began crafting posts that would celebrate the cultural exchange while maintaining appropriate dignity and protocol. The challenge was presenting the story in a way that honored both the Japanese visitors' gesture and the guards' professional response. The monk Jishin had remained largely silent during the public aspects of their demonstration, but afterward he became the spiritual interpreter of what they had accomplished. Speaking with his companions over dinner that evening, he explained how their gesture had created what Buddhism calls merit positive karma that would benefit both the givers and receivers of their respectful action. His perspective helped the group understand their success in terms that connected to their deeper cultural and spiritual values. Kenji Sato, the former Self-Defense Forces officer, found himself in conversation with British veterans who approached him throughout the day. These encounters revealed the universal experiences that connect military service members across national boundaries, shared understanding of discipline, sacrifice, and the complex emotions involved in dedicating one's life to serving something larger than personal interest. These conversations reinforced his belief that military brotherhood transcends political and cultural differences. The cultural exchange student, Sakura Ito, experienced the day as a masterclass in international relations and cultural diplomacy. Her role as translator had given her unique insight into how carefully chosen words and gestures could create understanding across language barriers. She began writing detailed notes about the experience, recognizing that her academic studies had provided theoretical knowledge about cultural exchange, but this day had given her practical experience that would influence her future career. As news of the event spread through social media, responses came from around the world. Japanese social media users expressed pride in seeing their cultural values represented so positively in international settings. British responses were overwhelmingly positive, with many commenting on how the gesture had reminded them of the respect and gratitude that military service deserves. Veterans from various countries shared their own stories of international military cooperation and mutual respect. The ripple effects extended beyond social media into more substantial cultural impacts. A London-based Japanese cultural organization reached out to the group, inviting them to participate in upcoming cultural festivals and educational programs. British military historical societies expressed interest in learning more about Japanese military traditions and the cultural values that had motivated such a respectful gesture. The success of their planned tribute began inspiring other cultural exchange groups to consider similar gestures of international respect and understanding. Japanese community organizations in other countries started discussing their own versions of respectful cultural tributes, while British cultural organizations began exploring ways to reciprocate the gesture during visits to Japan or interactions with Japanese communities in Britain. Most significantly, the personal relationships formed during those few hours at Buckingham Palace continued to develop. Staff Sergeant Matthews and Hiroshi Tanaka exchanged contact information, beginning a correspondence that would continue for years. The elderly craftsman's letters, carefully translated by Sakura Ito, provided insights into Japanese culture and philosophy that enriched the British soldiers' understanding of international perspectives on military service. The day that had begun as a carefully planned gesture of respect had evolved into something far more significant, a demonstration of how individual citizens, acting with thoughtfulness and cultural sensitivity, could create meaningful bridges between nations and contribute to international understanding in ways that formal diplomacy alone could never achieve. 6 months later, the impact of that remarkable day at Buckingham Palace continued to generate positive developments that none of the original participants could have imagined. The story had taken on a life of its own, inspiring similar gestures of cultural respect around the world and fundamentally changing how both Japanese and British communities thought about grassroots cultural diplomacy and the power of individual action to create international understanding. Hiroshi Tanaka, now back in his workshop in Kyoto, found himself busier than ever, but not with his traditional woodworking commissions. Requests poured in from cultural organizations, schools, and community groups wanting him to speak about the planning and execution of their tribute to the Royal Guard. His simple gesture of respect had transformed him into an unexpected ambassador for Japanese cultural values, a role he embraced with the same careful attention to detail that characterized his craftsmanship. The letters exchanged between Hiroshi and Staff Sergeant Matthews had evolved into a friendship that bridged not only cultural differences but also the gap between military and civilian perspectives on service and duty. Matthews had shared stories about his military training and deployment experiences, while Hiroshi responded with insights about Japanese concepts of dedication and perfection that resonated strongly with military values of discipline and excellence. More significantly, their correspondence had caught the attention of military historians and cultural researchers on both sides of the Pacific. The Japan-Britain Society in Tokyo invited both men to participate in a symposium on military traditions and cultural exchange, leading to Matthews receiving his first-ever invitation to visit Japan as an honored guest rather than in any official military capacity. Dr. Yamamoto had returned to his university position with renewed energy for his research into international relations and cultural diplomacy. The experience at Buckingham Palace provided him with a perfect case study for his theories about how individual citizens could influence international relationships through carefully considered cultural gestures. His academic papers on the subject began attracting international attention from scholars studying grassroots diplomacy and cultural bridge building. The success of their gesture had also inspired Dr. Yamamoto to develop a new course curriculum focusing on practical cultural diplomacy. Students in his program would study successful examples of cross-cultural understanding and, then, design their own respectful tribute projects. The Buckingham Palace experience became the foundational case study, demonstrating how thorough research, cultural sensitivity, and genuine respect could create meaningful international connections. Yuki Nakamura found that her tea ceremony demonstrations had taken on new dimensions as audiences became interested in the philosophical principles that had motivated the tribute to the Royal Guard. Her teachings about harmony, respect, purity, and tranquility resonated with people seeking practical ways to create better relationships across cultural boundaries. The tea ceremony became a vehicle for explaining deeper Japanese values that could be applied to international understanding. Her cultural center in London had established a permanent program of Japanese cultural education specifically inspired by the positive response to their gesture. British participants in tea ceremony classes often mentioned being drawn by their desire to understand the cultural values that could motivate such a respectful international tribute. The classes became opportunities for meaningful cultural exchange rather than mere exotic entertainment. Sakura Ito had returned to her studies with a completely transformed understanding of her academic focus on international relations. The practical experience of serving as cultural translator and diplomatic facilitator had given her insights that no textbook could provide. Her detailed documentation of the planning process, execution, and aftermath of their cultural tribute became the foundation for her senior thesis on grassroots cultural diplomacy. More importantly, Sakura had been inspired to establish a student organization dedicated to planning and executing similar cultural exchange projects. The group's first initiative was organizing a reciprocal gesture of respect when a Japanese military ceremonial unit visited Britain for a joint training exercise. The success of this project led to invitations for Sakura to advise other student organizations planning international cultural exchanges. The monk Jishin had integrated the experience into his teachings about Buddhist principles of compassion and interconnectedness. His sermons began incorporating the story as an example of how mindful action could create positive karma that benefits entire communities rather than just individual participants. The concept of merit generated through respectful action toward strangers became a powerful teaching tool for explaining how personal spiritual development connects to broader social harmony. His temple had established a meditation garden dedicated to international peace and understanding, with stones contributed by visitors from various countries who had been inspired by the story of the tribute to the Royal Guard. The garden became a pilgrimage destination for people interested in exploring how spiritual principles could be applied to international relations and cultural understanding. Kenji Sato had found himself invited to speak at military academies and veteran organizations about the universal values that connect military service across national boundaries. His perspective as a former Japanese officer who had witnessed the profound impact of respectful recognition on British Guards provided unique insights into military psychology and the importance of international military cooperation. These speaking engagements led to invitations for Sato to participate in international veterans conferences and military history symposiums. His contributions helped establish new dialogues between former military personnel from different countries, creating networks of understanding that supported both individual healing from military service experiences and broader international cooperation. Back at Buckingham Palace, the story of the Japanese tribute had become part of the informal lore shared among guard units. New recruits were told the story as an example of why their service carried international significance and deserved to be conducted with the highest standards of professionalism and pride. The wooden gifts from Hiroshi's cherry tree had become treasured symbols passed down through guard rotations, maintaining connection to the values of international respect and recognition. Staff Sergeant Matthews had been selected to represent his regiment at cultural exchange events, partly because of his gracious handling of the Japanese tribute situation. His natural diplomacy and genuine appreciation for international friendship made him an effective ambassador for British military values. He often carried one of Hiroshi's wooden gifts during these events, using it to tell the story of how respectful cultural exchange could create lasting positive relationships. The palace's official social media presence had evolved to include more stories about positive international interactions and cultural exchanges involving the Royal Guard. The success of posts about the Japanese tribute demonstrated public appetite for stories that celebrated international friendship and mutual respect. These posts consistently received higher engagement than traditional ceremonial content, suggesting that audiences were hungry for examples of positive cultural connection. British tourism organizations had begun incorporating the story into their promotional materials, highlighting London's role as a destination where meaningful cultural exchanges could occur. The story served as evidence that Britain welcomed respectful international visitors and valued the cultural contributions they brought. Tourism statistics showed measurable increases in visitors from Japan, many specifically mentioning the tribute story as motivation for their travel. The success of the original gesture had inspired similar tributes from other cultural groups visiting London. A delegation of South African military veterans had organized their own respectful tribute, followed by representatives from Canadian and Australian military organizations. Each group adapted the basic concept to reflect their own cultural traditions while maintaining the core principles of respect, preparation, and genuine appreciation for military service. These subsequent tributes had established an informal tradition of international cultural recognition at Buckingham Palace. Palace officials, initially uncertain about how to handle these unprecedented expressions of respect, had developed protocols for acknowledging such gestures while maintaining appropriate security and ceremonial standards. The Japanese group's careful preparation and respectful execution had set the standard for future cultural tributes. International media coverage had evolved beyond the initial human interest story to deeper analyses of grassroots cultural diplomacy and its potential impact on international relations. Academic conferences began featuring panels on citizen diplomacy, using the Buckingham Palace tribute as a case study in effective cross-cultural communication and relationship building. The story had also influenced official diplomatic programming, with both Japanese and British cultural agencies incorporating lessons learned from the tribute's success into their cultural exchange initiatives. The demonstrated power of carefully planned, respectful cultural gestures to create positive international attention and genuine emotional connections had convinced diplomatic professionals of the value of supporting and facilitating grassroots cultural exchanges. As the first anniversary of their tribute approached, Hiroshi began planning a return visit to London, this time bringing a larger group that would include some of the British friends and international connections that had developed from their original gesture. The anniversary celebration would demonstrate how a single day of respectful cultural exchange had grown into an ongoing network of international friendship and understanding that continued to generate positive impacts for individuals and communities on both sides of the Pacific Ocean.